And our next speaker is a researcher from the University of South Carolina, and he is the first time he connects with the community of Mentoring Europe, and we are very much excited to see and hear what he has to, what his story. Please welcome Professor Samuel McQuillin.
You can use that one, or do you want a hand mic? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Fiona and Gas, for this. So the title of the presentation is, What is Evidence-Based Mentoring? Ilana set me up well, noting that the Mentoring Europe is not focused on any kind of mentoring, but really it's grounded in an approach that's informed by evidence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrestle a little bit with what this term means, and I'd also encourage others, either after the talk or throughout the conference, to think of your perspective. Your perspective might be different than mine, and that's okay. These are actually some things that I've learned through my own journey in my program of research, largely through things I've noticed that didn't sit well with me in the scholarship, but also some mistakes that I've made, where in hindsight, you would have thought that I would have known better, but hindsight's 20/20. Two big agenda items in this are, I'm going to talk most of the talk, probably the first 25 minutes are going to be on what evidence-based mentoring is not, which I think is arguably more important than having a definition for it. And then I'm going to move very briefly to a tripartite definition of what evidence-based mentoring is. What I mean by tripartite is going to have three parts to it. And this is largely going to be informed by my discipline. I'm a psychologist by training, but it's been adapted a little bit for mentoring based on some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I also, since it's rainy outside here, I have some beautiful pictures of the campus of the University of South Carolina that I took. So I'm an amateur photographer. So first I'd like to address this idea that the term evidence-based, and I know that we had a researcher group yesterday, and many of us talked about this. In a lot of ways, the term evidence-based is turned into a meme. And I don't mean like the funny Twitter images that we see. But actually the term meme was coined by a paleontologist named Richard Dawkins. And he described it as a way that we culturally transmit ideas or patterns. So a meme is something that we transmit to each other through non-genetic means, through information, and they typically through imitation, that we see something, it has some cultural value to it. Because it has cultural value, it's typically rewarded and it's shared, and we continue to use it. My perspective is, I think, and one that I'll build, is that the term evidence-based has become somewhat of a meme that's actually pretty far disassociated from the function of the scientific method and what the original term evidence-based was designed to do. So this might be hard to see, but this is from Google's Book Ngram, where they've scanned tons of books since the 1500s. And what you can do through this is you can look at the mention of certain words or phrases over time. And I drew this back to the 1980s, and you can see that in parallel, both mentoring and evidence-based are two terms that emerged pretty rapidly over this time period. Not many people prior to 1980 were talking about evidence-based practice or mentoring, whereas the cumulative scholarship over the past 20, 30 years has dramatically increased, and you'll notice that they reached somewhat of a crescendo in the past 5 to 10 years where we're talking about this. So I thought it was a good time to maybe parse this apart. What is evidence-based mentoring? So some notes on this meme before I jump into some problems that I have with it is these are not problems, these are realities that have happened. Nearly every helping profession, whether it's nursing, counseling, psychology, or mentoring, has undergone a dramatic shift in the expectations for how they are designed to produce their outcomes. This is largely carried through the term evidence-based. You'll see evidence-based nursing, evidence-based practice, evidence-based mentoring. This meme has been reinforced through cultural exchanges that rewards people and groups for using the phrase or adopting the term evidence-based. And for better or worse, I would maybe argue for worse, oftentimes the survival of fields, groups, organizations, or programs depend on affiliating with this phrase evidence-based. In the US, we've created registries of evidence-based programs where to get a funding line, you have to be affiliated with something, regardless of if you're actually doing it, right? It has no bearing on if you're actually doing something, but if you say that you are, It's a value judgment that the government has made for what evidence-based means. So why do I have problems with this? My biggest problem is I think we've blurred the lines between the form of the word evidence-based and the cultural significance of that and the function as it was originally intended. What I mean by form is the symbolic representation of the words evidence-based. It's a truth claim. It can't be bad if it's evidence-based, and it must be good. This is very different from the approach of the scientific method, which is focused on function, not form, and it always has been when successful. Function is incorporating research evidence when we make, influence, or justify key decisions in order to reduce the likelihood of errors or uncertainty. Instead of being a status symbol, it's a process. And the process involves acquiring information through a variety of means, not just systematic research studies, understanding that information, and then using that information to reduce uncertainty. So this is where I'm going to pick up some issues that I have with how we've thought about evidence-based practice, in particular with mentoring, and highlight what I think evidence-based practice isn't. And then at the very end, I'll say what I think it might be. And then I'd love to hear from others on this. So what isn't evidence-based mentoring? I'm going to review a couple studies. They're not in chronological order, but there's some studies that I've done over the past 10 or 15 years that have influenced my perspective on this. So I'm a school psychologist by training. A lot of my interest is in school mental health and strengthening and expanding school mental health systems. So I got interested in school-based mentoring as an opportunity to expand school mental health promotion efforts. When I started entering this field in 2010, this report came out by Wheeler et al. That was pretty surprising for the field, especially given that the U.S. government had just invested hundreds of millions of dollars into school-based mentoring. The conclusion of this report, after a series of randomized trials were released, was that we do not have sufficient evidence to either say that we can invest in this again to get the results that we expect. The quote is that arguments seemingly could be made for or against continued investments in mentoring. And actually, under the Obama administration, the funding line for the student mentoring program was cut because of these results. They're disappointing results for it. So my question is, what in the world's going on, right? We hear a lot about this stuff. We don't see the results. Something must be happening. So one of the things that I was interested in is common sense and some research evidence would tell us that under certain circumstances, mentoring works, and it seems to be pretty transformative in some ways. So my question was, what do mentors do when they're with mentees? Seemingly important, right? We would presume that the primary way that mentors influence mentees are by the context and things that they do when they're with them. Those seem like important features of a mentoring relationship. So what I did is a systematic review of the available published research studies on school-based mentoring with the simple research question, what do mentors do when they're with mentees? Or, more accurately, how do researchers report what mentors do when they're with mentees? What I found is that less than half of the studies made any reference to what mentors did when they're with mentees. Even more so, less than a fifth of studies reported any practices or activities that mentors were expected to do or not to do. And only 7% of studies included any measure at all of what mentors and mentees did with each other, which was surprising to me. So some of you might be asking, why is that surprising? Maybe it shouldn't have been, because almost 10 years before this, David Dubois published a scholarly article where the basic claim of this was, we've really only focused on how long the relationship lasts and how frequently they meet. Otherwise, we don't really know much. And we also know this just recently. The United States, as well as Canada, and I understand that Australia has adopted this as well, the elements of effective practice in mentoring detail 82 elements of effective practice. I don't have time to ask questions, but if you were to guess, how many of those have things to do with what mentors do when they're with mentees? 3. 2 of those are how to end the relationship, right? We don't have a lot there as well. So who cares if we don't specify what our treatments are in these evaluations? When we don't know what a treatment is, our science is not practically or scientifically useful. We can't test theories, and we can't inform practice when this happens. So we have a conundrum. Imagine asking a kid to take a pharmaceutical treatment. We say we don't really know if it works, and we also don't know what's in it. We probably wouldn't advise that. So this type of research environment creates a greenhouse for confusion and knee-jerk reactions to fads and trends and suggestions from others. But most important to me is the fact that we often have a Pollyannic assumption of mentors, that they're unconditionally beneficial. Whereas research evidence and common sense would also tell us that not all mentors are helpful, and there are potential harm behaviors that can occur in mentoring relationships. Even the most well-intentioned person could produce harm in a relationship. One example of this, the study is not published yet, it'll probably be published in this next year, my student, soon to be Dr. Anna Flittner, partnered with the researchers in the US, Bernadette Sanchez and Amy Anderson. And they were looking at conversations about race, class, and ethnicity in cross-race matches. And what they found is that mentors of privilege can use insensitive at best, or even aggressive language with mentees who are minoritized. And this is a big problem in the US for how these programs are structured. So I think most importantly, this issue of do no harm becomes paramount. So my first thing of what evidence-based mentoring isn't. Mentoring isn't evidence-based if we don't have research-informed expectations for what mentors do and don't do with mentees. What does that look like in practice? Regardless of if you buy into the idea of evidence-based practice, we should have some idea of what mentors are expected to do or not do when they're with mentees. And we should also, even if, again, you don't buy into the idea of evidence-based practice, we should have good reason to believe that these things that we're expecting mentors to do are likely to increase the desired outcomes that we want. There's a scholar in nursing named John Paley in the United Kingdom who's just recently retired, but he's a brilliant scholar in the philosophy of science, and he calls these checking procedures. It doesn't have to necessarily be formal systematic research. It can be, are we on the right track? Do we have a good reason to believe this? Or is this fantasy that we're expecting? So I'm going to go into the second part of this, what isn't evidence-based mentoring. This is my story of my first ever entrance into mentoring. I was originally trained as a school psychologist with the area of emphasis in quantitative research methods. So I had research methods in search of a problem to solve. So I fell into mentoring by circumstance, really. And what I was asked to do is there is this program, it was a university-school partnership of great acclaim, where university mentors would come into a middle school and mentor these young people as they transition from elementary school into the big, scary middle school. The thing that interests me, especially based on what I just discussed, is two of the staples of this program were evidence-based practices. Motivational interviewing, which is an approach to having conversations about behavior change. It's designed to increase motivation for behavior change, but also to reduce potential harm behaviors. We call them the writing reflex. Things like arguing, giving advice without suggestions, or labeling things. So it was really, I was enthusiastic about it. So we've got these great methods. We're going to do a randomized controlled trial. This program had universal acclaim. It was on the Provost University's webpage as a community engaged project. The school district had it on their webpage. They sent memos home to parents. Students were invited to this. So I was coming in, right, a conclusion in search of a fact. Let's go prove that it works. What we found is that students who were randomly assigned to receive a mentor relative to those who were assigned to a no mentor control group, school as usual, performed worse on nearly every outcome that we gave them, including academics, psychosocial indicators, and emotional indicators. Needless to say, the university nor the school were happy with me after we had these conversations. So I'd like to highlight this. What also isn't evidence-based mentoring is not simply asking mentors to do evidence-based things. But we learned a lot from this study. After negotiating with our IRB, right, we could go forward. Some of the things that we learned is mentors were doing things we asked them not to do. They were arguing, right? They were labeling, they were belittling, they were giving advice without permission. When we went through recordings of these relationships, it was really clear. But they were also not doing the things we asked them to do, to understand and appreciate the values of the young person, to communicate those values clearly in reflections, and to partner with the mentee based on what they would like to change rather than what the mentor would like to change. What we also found is that most mentees did not want to do the things that their mentor was asking them to. nor did they benefit from the activities that we had planned, even though our intentions were aligned with evidence-based practice. So what did we do? This is where it gets a little bit more positive, right? We started using research evidence in function to figure out what are our checking procedures, what do we need to know about? And some of the things, in hindsight, right, is 2020, are common sense. What we found is that most mentors forgot the training content within 3 weeks. There's a precipitous decline in the first 2 weeks, and it was almost gone by week 3. This is very common. In fact, one of the first psychological experiments ever conducted by Hermann Ebbinghaus found something called the forgetting curve. Right? It seems almost nonsensical to state the fact that people forget things. And they forget things in particular when they're not mastered or they aren't easy. Motivational interviewing is neither of those things. So the forgetting curve looks like this. So something to think about. Your program or our public health initiatives to strengthen natural mentoring relationships might not be asking people to do motivational interviewing. You might. But odds are, I'm guessing that there are some things we would like mentors to do and other things we'd like them not to do. And moreover, I would guess that oftentimes these things that we're asking them to do or not to do are not entirely intuitive, are easily forgotten, and often not done as expected. The great thing about this forgetting curve, though, that early psychological research would show is that even though we forget, if we have nudges or prompts that are immediately provided before the point of performance, meaning when the behavior is expected, that forgetting curve almost goes away, and it almost looks like we have retention. So we use this research evidence to revise our protocols. We designed 2 structures that were integrated and complementary. One called proactive support. Proactive support is where a supervisor anticipates the most common problems in relationships, proactively reaches out to the mentor, and gives them some guidance, wisdom, or resources to navigate that. The other thing is that we developed automated, on-demand, just-in-time trainings. So these are on-demand training videos that are designed to increase competency in very specific tasks. Here's an example one. This is actually me with a young person doing the value card sort that we had when we did it. What you'll notice, I'm not going to go through all the stats on this, we had pretty dramatic changes in the second randomized controlled trial. For those that care, the effect sizes on mentors' perceptions of training and values of support were in the Cohen's D of 0.9 or 0.8 range, which is large by traditional standards. Moreover, mentors were more satisfied with their mentoring relationship, and they were more likely to commit to a second season of mentoring with the youth that they had. If you look at the actual effect size of these randomized controlled trials, you'll see that the 0 on the y-axis means that there's no effect, right? That first trial, the modal effect size was harmful, right? When we revised our training structures and integrated that proactive support, we started seeing modest positive effects. But when we added those just-in-time trainings that really prompted that behavior from mentors, we saw even greater increases in their performance and the things that we would like them to do, and decreases in the things that we would not like them to do. This is also consistent with some other research that I did with the National Mentoring Partnership in the US, where I analyzed data from 1,400 mentoring programs accounting for over 400,000 youth. This is program-level data, and we were interested actually in what predictors, out of 30 predictors ranging from demographics to financial things, what is the best predictor of premature match closure or matches falling apart? The single best predictor that we found out of 32 of these indicators was ongoing program training and support for mentors. We also found out that my videos were awful. So this was actually one of the kinder comments. That videos were helpful, but they were cringe to watch. And in YouTube, you can actually look at the indicators of when people stop watching, and there were pretty precipitous declines shortly into the video. So I wanted to bring this up because oftentimes using research evidence, the way that we're talking about it, is not simply going to research articles, but there's disciplines and professions that know things that we have no clue about. For example, production value and script writing and storytelling. So we ended up getting a generous grant in partnership again with Mentor National in the US to develop these really highly produced videos encouraging mentors to use motivational interviewing with specific activities. They had well-written scripts. They had actors that weren't me. They weren't filmed on a GoPro in my garage, right? And it looks like the mentors actually appreciate these videos better. And we have data, again, our checking procedures from our YouTube channel where the watch retention rates are much higher. People are watching them a lot more than they were the other videos that we had. So my second point, what mentoring isn't. Mentoring isn't evidence-based if programs don't have the capacity to carry out the practices as expected. We should have good reason to believe that mentors should, can, and will do what we expect of them. Otherwise, those expectations might not be reasonable, and we'll set ourselves up for the study that I originally referenced. How we address this is we must have support structures in place that ensure practices are routinely implemented as expected. If we can't reach that, then we should probably change our expectations. So the final what mentoring isn't, or what isn't evidence-based mentoring, and I think this is arguably the most important and probably the least focused on right now, is it's not insisting on programs and mentors to do things in the absence of the characteristics, preferences, and sociocultural context of the youth, mentors, and families who are involved in this relationship. And my work in this is actually relatively recent, and it's in partnership with Mentor Together, which is the first and largest mentoring NGO in India, serving thousands of youth. They became really interested in the idea of motivational interviewing, and our program in particular, and wanted to adapt it. And my first reaction was, sure, what could go wrong? We'll adapt it. But then I remembered, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And I said, wait a minute, we've got to slow way down. Because many of the characteristics, preferences, and sociocultural contexts where we developed these programs, U.S. states like Texas, South Carolina, Virginia, Arkansas, and we had some development efforts in the United Kingdom. They're very different than the 4 cities in India that we're hoping to transition this program to. So we actually took a formal approach called the Cultural Adaptation Framework, which is a research-informed approach to adapting evidence-based practices based on the characteristics, preferences, and culture of the groups that we intend to serve. What we found is that there are key differences in the systems at the governmental level, and the mentors in terms of their culture and values, and the mentees as well. We also found that the program desired different outcomes. There was different support structures that they had that the United States may not have had, and there were also vice versa. So their outcomes shifted a little bit, which by default would probably change the program in some important ways. But I would say most importantly, the program was very Western. In particular, a lot of the development sites were southern United States. So we had to think about this. And if you remember, one of the core components of motivational interviewing is an emphasis on people's individual values and ideals and how those connect to what they'd like to do in life. So I'm going to give one example. It's a bigger program than this, but this is one example, and it's a staple of motivational interviewing that you do, something called a value card sort. The value card sort works like this. You have 3 categories, very important, important, and not important, and you have a deck of cards that have values. We did a lot of qualitative research in our development sites on what is valuable to children and families, and how are these values likely connected to social, emotional, behavioral, and academic outcomes. What the youth does is they then sort these cards, but there's a catch. They can only put 5 in the very important category. What we're trying to do is isolate what is most important in this person's life, because that should be the foundation of any conversation about changing behaviors or moving the needle on outcomes. Importantly, though, this is culturally loaded, right? So what we ended up doing is partnering with the providers, the mentees, and the staff at Mentor Together to really take a look at, what values might be consistent. What we found out is that these weren't simple translation issues. Values and culture were pretty different in unique circumstances. So rather than simple translations, we had to take this emic perspective of really getting into these young people's lives and understanding the perspectives of the mentors and the program on how they would like this to be structured. And if you can actually read some of the language here, you'll notice that the English translations don't actually work very well. And that was something that Arundhati Gupta, the CEO of Mentor Together, frequently said, is that there's actually not a good translation for some of this stuff. Hence the importance of the work. We also engaged in cycles of feedback and revision, where we would take a look at something, we'd test it out, checking procedure, we'd see if that cultural adaptation was necessary or beneficial, and we'd go back and say, you know what, I think we're in a good spot right now, or we're way off with this. So my third, what evidence-based mentoring isn't evidence-based if we don't consider the characteristics, preferences, and sociocultural context of the youth, families, and mentors that are involved in this. And I think if we're thinking about a public health approach to expanding access to natural mentoring relationships, we need to be creating context for community ownership and inclusion so that the values of the people who are involved in these services are not only considered, but they're invited to participate, they're involved in the development of these programs, and they contribute at all levels of involvement. We should have these, to use John Paley's phrase, checking procedures at every level of our program designed to promote and assess the cultural fit between the expectations and the people who are involved. So, if it's not all of these things, what is evidence-based mentoring? And what's the definition that I've come up with? So this is an adaptation, as I mentioned, from APA's definition of evidence-based practice, but it's specific to mentoring in some unique ways because of differences in the role and profession of a psychologist versus what a mentor is. So it's a three-part definition, and my perspective is you can't have any of these without the other two. So it necessarily involves the integration of three domains, and these three domains are practices informed by the best available research evidence, the capacity of mentors and programs to carry out the practice in the manner expected, the practice or the program. If we're thinking about natural mentoring relationships and we know that there's something that's really critical and we have a public health campaign to raise awareness about it, do we actually expect that the information we've provided to the community is sufficient for them to actually do these things or not do them in the way expected? And then finally, maybe most importantly, privileging the characteristic preferences and sociocultural background of all who are involved in these efforts. So I've got a couple conclusions and then some final thoughts, and then I'd love to hear reactions, questions, or thoughts about this, or your own experiences that have informed your perspective. My perspective is that the field would benefit from moving far away from the meme-like depiction of evidence-based practice, where we emphasize form or the symbolic representation of some value. It must be good if it's evidence-based. Instead, I think that we would tremendously benefit the field if at every level, from practice to research to policy, we moved more towards a function-based approach to evidence-based mentoring, where we privilege the process, the function, over the form. What I mean by function is incorporating research evidence when we make, influence, and justify key decisions in order to reduce the likelihood that we make errors similar to the ones that I discussed and made in the presentation. A change in this would necessarily involve a process where stakeholders, policymakers, public health experts, and mentoring program managers are acquiring information from a variety of sources, understanding that information, and then using that information to reduce uncertainty and reduce the likelihood that we make errors. So a couple final thoughts on this is, again, I think evidence-based mentoring is best considered as a process of reducing the likelihood of errors in mentoring programs and practices. And I think if we emphasize this function of reducing uncertainty through these checking procedures, we'll be better off. And I think probably the best way that we can think about this succinctly is through that tripartite definition. That is the integration of practices informed by the best available evidence, thinking about the capacity of the mentor or the program to carry out the practice in the manner expected, and then the characteristics, preferences, and sociocultural context of those that are involved in this service. So thank you for your time. And I think I'm actually 3 minutes earlier than expected. So.
Thank you very much.
Somebody was concerned that I had 40 sheets, so I just had to bring that up. I don't remember who said that. It might have been Sylvia. So. And This is my Twitter handle, my email address. Happy to share any of the studies that I mentioned. Are we doing questions now or later?
Yeah, sure. If you have questions, please raise your hand. I will walk towards you.
Yep.
We have a question over here.
Woohoo, wait.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Onur Sultan. I'm from Beyond Horizon. My question is, do you have experience about justice-involved youth? The youth that has, in a way, committed a crime, and how do we implement this mentoring program with this kind of youth?
Yeah. So the closest that so motivational interviewing has been used in, like, it's the most studied form of counseling in the world right now in terms of, like, structured approaches to counseling. And there's lots of great evidence. Some of the best evidence that actually emerged from substance use and abuse literature. So people who have chemical dependent, very sticky behaviors. They're hard to change. The closest research that I've done in this sector is with youth who are at risk for the justice involvement. So we did a randomized trial that was actually just published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences on the top 10% of disruptive behavior in schools. So we took the disruptive behavior records and we sorted it, and we invited the top 10% of kids in that program those levels of impairment into the program. We did a randomized trial of that, and it seemed to work pretty well in reducing the severity of disruptive behavior and then also some mental health symptoms that we had. But we haven't actually done it with youth who are actively involved in justice systems.
Does that answer your question?
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm very humbled, actually. We've learned a lot from you. I just wanted to, it's a question and a remark at the same time, maybe you can answer. We were talking about expectations that we have from the, but isn't it more the expectation that the mentee has and the balance between the expectation of the mentor rather than our expectation? I mean, our expectation as project leaders is basically if the expectation of both applies to them. It's always we are following rather than having expectation as of the beginning. So maybe I misunderstood you when you spoke about the expectation.
Right.
Yeah, our expectation.
I think it's a brilliant comment, and I think it highlights the importance that you can't have one of these parts without the other. So a key aspect of this idea is that the preferences of the youth matter. Right, so that, to use your term, the expectations of youth matter, their characteristics matter. And we've seen this in our own program is there are some curricular aspects of our program that involve, academic training and things like that. And we have to coach our mentors, like if that's getting in the way of the relationship, right, that's not what you need to be doing, right? And I think that's part of what happened in this first trial is that we set these mentors loose without thinking about the preferences or expectations that the mentees had. Which, by the way, is very inconsistent with proper motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is explicitly designed to be person-centered rather than mentor or clinician-centered. That's a comment's very well taken.
Yeah. We've been on the road actually for Made to Match for the last 17 years. And we found out that it is magical moment when the first introduction of the mentor with the mentee. It's really a magical moment where you may clarify the expectation of both parties, actually. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sherilyn Mila. I'm from Kvinfo in Denmark. I just wanted to ask a question that goes a little bit beyond the topic of preferences. I was wondering if there are any studies that have been carried out regarding the dynamics of power between mentors and mentees.
So I would actually have to point to the research of Dr. Bernadette Sanchez, who's at UIC in the States. She has a tremendous amount of research on both the potential benefits and risks of mentoring. In particular, she studied cross-race matches and how power influences those, and practices that can impede racial identity development, but then also support that. And there's her research lab, Amy Anderson is affiliated with her as well, and I mentioned my student, Anna Flitner, is doing some work with them. But that, to me, I think is the next frontier in this idea of the three-part definition, is understanding this idea of characteristics necessarily involve some power differential, especially between mentors and mentees, but when race, class, gender, and other characteristics are considered, it's a really important part.
We have a question there, and we have a question there.
Thanks very much. I was just reflecting on the term evidence-based and the roots of it and the timeline that you gave as well, and some of the language around treatment that kind of comes with that, and consequently then the focus on what we expect people to do. And I just wonder if, in the context of the research that you've been involved in, if you explored how we expect people to be, because I think that's kind of the fundamental difference in the mentoring relationship. We heard earlier it's very much a human relationship. It's not a specific intervention as such, even though we're measuring it as intervention type activity. But I just wondered, did you look at the aspect of how we expect people to be in the relationship?
That's a great question. I think it's relevant to everything that we're talking about. The easy answer to that is that proper motivational interviewing privileges the agenda of the person who's being helped, presumably being helped. So the idea there is that if they're not interested or willing or don't see a need to change, then that's their choice, and they have complete autonomy to make that choice. I think to answer your question, one of the guiding principles, I think, in this idea of autonomy supportive mentoring is there's a general desire of most helpers to reduce suffering or enhance well-being. I think that gets at your point, what is reasonable to expect in that. And from the perspective of our program, there's some assumptions that we make about what are some things that might be causing suffering in this mentee's life, or what are some things that could enhance their well-being that we would like to guide them towards. But ultimately, that's up to them to make those choices with the support of their mentor. But I think to your point, if I understood it correctly, is how do we expect people to be, in these circumstances? A lot of that depends on, it's being person-centered, right? It's what are their expectations, what are their family's expectations, and where they are. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, well, I suppose I was wondering if there's specific things that are being looked at in terms of how people show up, because I don't think it's necessarily about an intention of alleviating suffering, or but it's about being present and about listening and very specific things that ultimately build trust, which is ultimately how you're going to impact somebody in the long term. So it's kind of drilling down those aspects in the same way as looking at what people do is in some ways easier measured, because take the list of how they've done X, Y, and Z, looking at how they behave, how they are.
Right. So I misunderstood the question. So yes, and this gets into leaning into the motivational interviewing literature. The motivational interviewing literature talks about the spirit of motivational interviewing, which is a lot of how you show up. It's characterized by being empathic, autonomy supportive, and reflective, that you're listening and reflecting with them. And it's built on the backbone of, they call them the ORs, which are the behaviors that you look at: open-ended questions, accurate reflections of empathy, affirmations, and then summaries. Those are the behaviors, but the spirit is this idea that the person feels understood, heard, and respected, and they feel like they can trust the person they're working with. And that goes into a lot of the training features of how we train people in that. And that's pretty consistent with almost all evidence-based helping traditions of that supportive autonomy, with some maybe more nuances in motivational interviewing. So thank you.
We have a question online, because the event is also being online streamed. So Galena here is following the chat box.
So the question is from Vanessa Bronhorst, and she says that they're starting up new mentoring program in Rotterdam and would like to find more information about your best practices, studies, and information. So she's asking where she can find this information.
Can she see the screen to email me? That's probably the easiest way. So yeah, if not, you can type my email in there. But the one good news is that part of the investment that we got for producing some of these nice videos, they're going to be public domain, in addition to some additional training resources on motivational interviewing. So it's very it is mentor specific. So there's a lot of stuff in counseling and nursing and things like that, but not a lot in mentoring.
I have a question related a little bit to that.
Yeah.
If a mentoring organization would like to apply the knowledge, this third part procedure you mentioned, what are the struggles she will be facing? Because how can we move towards your research and put it into practice?
So the question is how can we take some of the practices that we have and do them? And the cheap answer for this is I think that it necessarily involves an assessment of organizational capacity. So that second part of the tripartite. Do we have the capacity to do this in terms of our training, support, and supervision? But then also considering, is this a good fit with the type of youth we serve, the cultural context of the youth that we serve, and how our mentors are recruited into the program or not. What we found working with our Indute Gupta with Mentor Together is that a lot of our assumptions going into that were just not realistic or fantasy at best. And what we had to do is figure out carefully, how do we adapt this program with our checking procedures in a way that would make it fit. And I think that we were successful in that, and that the paper kind of documents the rigor with which it took to actually adapt that program. But my general kind of reaction to that is one of these things where it's someone, you hear there's a simple solution to every complicated problem, and it's always wrong. So it's probably going to be more complicated than I think most people would like to it, because programs and contexts are so different. It won't be as simple as plug and play where we get something. It would be great if we had something like that. But
there are two questions there, and the lady in the front, she was, yeah. And I think that is all the time we have for the questions. So 3 more questions.
Hi,
Yeah.
Dr. Judy Gannon from Oxford University. I'm really fascinated, Sam, in the way that you've brought together research and practice. And I wonder what you think are the best ways forward for that collaboration between researchers stuck in universities who are desperate to kind of support programs and programs who want to be informed by the way we approach research. So what would your recommendations be to kind of both partners there?
yeah. So I have 2 soapboxes that I'm going to be very brief on this. My first thought is I don't think that programs should be evaluating themselves for outcome evaluations. Process evaluation, things like that are all fair game. Our checking procedures are great evaluation tools. So one, I think that that's a role of researchers, is to play that independent role of actually going about this type of assessment. My other soapbox is we have to stop evaluating programs. It's a very misguided approach to mentoring. These big randomized evaluations of mentoring programs, it's generally not a good idea. We need to be evaluating mentoring practices. So what do mentors do with mentees, and do those things work in these specific contexts with these specific program structures? I think that we probably lost 30 years of research evaluating these big programs where we don't know what mentors are doing with mentees. So. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Fatih Yilmaz from Beyond the Horizon, Belgium. So my question is on mentor training. You have mentioned that many mentors forget what they have been told at the mentor training, or they don't follow. So what works at the mentor training, or do you have good practices within your research?
Yeah. So again, I think it depends on we got a great evidence-based practice, which probably satisfies the first of the 3 parts. The other 2 parts are the program capacity and the individual characteristics. My perspective is that if you have volunteer mentors and you want them to do specific things, and those specific things require more than maybe 30 or 40 minutes of training, they better look really slick, and they better be inviting so that the mentor's engaged and wants to complete them. We're competing for their attention. It's not their fault if the training is bad, right? The other part of it, there are mentors, like, for example, the organization in the United States of professional mentoring, like Friends of the Children, which essentially commits to 12 years of professional mentoring, where a mentor meets with a small group of kids 4 hours or so a week, and they do that for 12 years. They have a fiduciary responsibility. It's their job to do some of these things. I think those expectations might be more professional. I was really interested in the certificates that are being discussed at Parliament for how we might certify people in schools or context to do some of this stuff. But again, I think that the answer to that question depends on the latter two of the tripartite model. But I do think that one of the things that I'm excited about and interested in are these ideas of just-in-time trainings, where you don't have to master it, you don't have to have complete mastery over it, you can get nudges immediately before you are expected to do it. And this literature actually came from nursing as well, where some splints and stitches are complicated, they require extra technical expertise, and what they started doing is they would have algorithm charts. If the cut looks like this, sew it like this. If it looks like that, don't do this. And what they would do is they would have little videos that would show how to do it so they could double check themselves before they would do a procedure to make sure they did it right. And that's something for me that's really exciting and kind of interesting. And I think that's all the time we have for questions. Okay.
Well, last one more.
Hi, I am Serkan Tezgel from Yana Mentoring from Germany. We have been developing a mentoring program for youth between the age 13 and 19 years old. And we are trying to reach different cultures, different social contexts. And my question is regarding how we should try to build the first connection with such a youth group, and how can we make the families a part of such a mentoring program? Probably you have seen such practical implications, and there are lots of methods for that. And how can we build this communication effective throughout the program, considering the families also and different social contexts? Thank you.
So, it's a great question. Probably to answer it where I would feel comfortable beyond the scope of what we have the time for. But my general kind of reaction to that is, especially if we're working with groups who are very different from the people who have expectation on the program, we really need to invite the groups' participation, collaboration, and ownership. Otherwise, it'll probably end up being like a town versus gown type arrangement. I think a great way to do that is to figure out their perspectives, their understanding of what they might benefit from or their needs, rather than us coming in and telling them kind of, hey, here's some things that you need to work on or that we want to help you with. From that. But key champions is a term in the literature of finding people who are connected to the effort, but that also emic to the groups that we're interested in working with, that can have a voice, but can also serve as an opportunity to share information in a way that is meaningful to the people we're working with.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think we are all going to check our YouTube status now.
Thank you. Sorry.